brief audio sting for reformed thinking. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're opening up a really famous section of Christian writing. We're going to be tackling a virtue that the author himself calls the most unpopular of the Christian virtues, chastity.
That's right. And we're looking at C.S. Lewis's discussion on sexual morality in Mere Christianity.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is he doesn't approach this like some, scolding Puritan. It's more like a sharp analysis, like a doctor diagnosing a condition.
Right, and he's really looking at human instinct and culture and trying to get us to look at the objective standards of the moral law, which, of course, we believe is rooted in God's character. It seems like he's confronting this idea, which is still so popular, that if we all just relaxed and were more natural about sex, all our problems would just disappear.
Exactly. So our goal here is to really pull out Lewis's core logic.
Yeah.
We want to see how he separates the Christian rule from just social customs.
And then get into why he argues the sexual instinct itself is fundamentally broken.
Right. And then how he frames the whole struggle for this virtue. And this is the part I think is so fascinating. His conclusion about where sexual sin actually ranks among all the other sins.
Yeah, that part is always a shocker.
And for you, our listener, who's interested in Reformed thought, Lewis's analysis of this warped instinct is just a powerful, almost empirical illustration of the doctrine of the fall.
It really is the systematic corruption of human nature right there.
Yes, and realizing that, it just pushes us toward the only real solution in our tradition, which is absolute reliance on God's sovereign grace for both the will and the ability to follow his commands.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's see why Lewis thinks our sexual appetite has gone, in his words, so preposterously wrong.
And why just defining that problem correctly is the first step toward any kind of cure.
So the first thing he does is separate two ideas that we always seem to mash together.
Yes, chastity and what he calls propriety or decency. If you don't make that distinction right at the start, you're going to get completely lost.
You'll end up mistaking, changing fashions for a fixed moral principle?
Exactly. You lose your footing as soon as society decides to change its mind, which it always does.
So chastity, that's the virtue itself. It's objective, it's fixed. It's the same for all Christians in all places at all times. And his definition is so simple and so stark.
It is. It just cuts through everything. The rule is either marriage with complete faithfulness to your partner or else total abstinence. That's it.
No cultural loophole.
None. And then you have propriety or decency.
Yeah.
And that is, completely the opposite. It's all about social convention, the shifting cultural rules.
So that's the stuff that dictates, how much of your body you should show or what words you can and can't say in polite company.
Right. And it's so specific to a time and a place. The rules of decency in, say, a small town in the 1950s are going to be wildly different from a city today. But the virtue of chastity, that doesn't move.
Lewis gives a couple of really clear examples to show how this works, how propriety changes, but chastity stays the same. The one I always remember is the Pacific Island girl versus the Victorian lady.
It's a great image. He says, imagine this girl wearing hardly any clothes, and then this Victorian woman covered from head to toe.
And his point is that both of them could be equally decent by the standards of their own society.
Exactly. And more to the point, they could be equally chaste or unchaste, and it has nothing to do with their dress.
The virtue is internal. It's in the heart and the will. It's not about how many yards of cloth you have on.
Right. And you could be perfectly decent on the outside, conforming to every little social rule, and be totally unchaste in your heart.
Or the reverse.
Or the reverse. You could be technically improper by one culture's standard, but be completely chaste in your actual intent.
He does the same thing with language, which feels very relevant today.
It does. He points out that chaste women in Shakespeare's time used language that a 19th century woman would have found, completely vulgar.
So the words themselves, the taboos, they change. The virtue doesn't.
And this is such a critical tool for moral clarity. It helps us avoid that kind of Phariseeism, where we get so obsessed with the outside stuff that we forget what's required on the inside.
So the question then becomes, when does breaking a social rule, propriety, actually cross the line and become a sin against chastity?
Right. When does bad manners become a moral breach?
And Lewis has a very clear answer for that.
He does. He says breaking the rule of propriety only offends against chastity if the break is made in order to excite lust, either in yourself or in other people.
So it all comes back to intent, which is, a core biblical idea. If you deliberately dress or speak to lead people into lust, that's the sin. Doesn't matter how normal that style is in your culture.
But if it's just ignorance,
Hmm.
Or carelessness. Maybe you're a young person wearing what everyone else wears, but it shocks an older person.
Then Lewis says it's just bad manners. It's not a sin against chastity.
What about doing it on purpose to get a reaction, to shock people? We see a lot of that.
Yeah, and his answer here is interesting. He says that's a sin against charity, but not necessarily chastity.
So if you get a thrill out of making people uncomfortable or embarrassed, that's uncharitable. It's cruel, maybe it's prideful, but it's not automatically a sexual sin.
He's being very precise, trying to keep us from just lumping all kinds of impropriety into one big category of sexual sin.
Which is really helpful.
What I find kind of surprising, though, is that Lewis, writing when he did, actually saw the relaxation of those old fussy rules of propriety as a good thing.
I know you wouldn't expect that, would you? But I think he just despised hypocrisy. He says a strict or fussy standard of propriety isn't any proof of chastity, and it's not even a help to it.
So the old Victorian way of hushing everything up, being terrified of basic biology, he thinks that actually made things worse.
I think so. It created this culture where the body itself became this shameful, obsessive focus. By relaxing those external rules, you force the moral struggle back inside, into the will, which is where it belongs.
It shifts the focus from your clothes to your heart, but he does admit it creates a problem.
Oh, absolutely. The problem is confusion. You have different generations, different groups of people, all operating by different standards of propriety. And that causes friction.
Right. You get misjudgments, hurt feelings. One group thinks being open is pure. Another thinks being modest is the only virtue.
And both are missing the point about what chastity actually is.
So he gives some practical advice for how to navigate that confusion, and it's all rooted in charity.
It is. He basically tells the older generation, be careful. Don't just assume that because a young person dresses or speaks in a way you find improper, that they're morally corrupt.
That kind of quick judgment is its own kind of sin.
Exactly. And then he tells the younger generation they have a duty too.
Don't just write off your elders as prudes or Puritans because they're uncomfortable with the new standards. Show them some charity for their discomfort.
And his solution to all this is so simple. Just have a real desire to believe the best you can about other people and try to make them as comfortable as possible.
Which shifts the whole focus away from policing each other's behavior and puts it on loving your neighbor. Always the higher virtue.
Always.
Okay, so once he's clarified the rule, he gets to the core of his argument. He says the Christian rule is so difficult, so contrary to our instincts, that one of two things must be true.
Either Christianity is wrong, or our sexual instinct, as it is right now, has gone wrong.
And he, of course, argues for the second one. He says the instinct itself is broken, and he gives some very specific reasons why.
And he has to do this. Because if the instinct were healthy, the Christian rule would just seem cruel and arbitrary.
Like God is just trying to stop us from having fun.
Right. But if you can show that the instinct is already in a, quote, ludicrous and preposterous excess, then the rule starts to look like medicine. It's corrective. It's meant to heal something that's wounded.
And that idea fits perfectly with the Reformed doctrine of total depravity, right? That the fall corrupted every part of us, including our basic drives.
It's a perfect illustration of it. So let's look at his first reason, which you call the biological purpose test.
Right, his analogy between food and sex.
He starts with a baseline. The biological purpose of eating is to repair the body. The biological purpose of sex is to have children. Simple enough.
Then he asks, how far has our fallen nature corrupted each of those drives?
With food, he says, look, most of us eat too much if we just follow our inclinations. We're gluttonous.
Yeah.
Maybe we eat enough for 2 people, but not enough for 10.
The appetite has gone a bit beyond its purpose, but it's not, totally unhinged.
Exactly. It's corrupted, but it's still sort of tethered to reality. But then he looks at the sexual appetite, and it's on a completely different scale.
This is where he uses that thought experiment. He says, if a healthy young man indulged his appetite every single time he felt inclined, and each act produced a baby.
In 10 years, he could populate a small village.
That image is so stark, populate a village. It really drives home the sheer scale of the excess.
It does. It shows this isn't a small glitch. It's a profound structural warping of the whole system. The appetite is in ludicrous and preposterous excess of its function. It's become an end in itself, completely detached from its purpose.
That's total depravity in action, right there on a physical level.
Without a doubt.
And the second reason, the cultural anomaly, might be even more powerful. I'm talking about the mutton chop analogy.
It's brilliant. because it forces you to step outside your own culture and see how weird it actually is.
So he asks you to imagine a country where people pack into a theater to watch a striptease act.
But instead of a person, it's a covered dinner plate. And it's slowly unveiled to reveal a mutton chop right before the lights go out.
If we saw that, we'd immediately think something is seriously wrong with the appetite for food in that country.
Of course we would. Our desire for food might be a little greedy, but it's not so broken that we've become obsessed with just the symbols and the anticipation of food.
And Lewis's point is that the state of the sex instinct in our culture, with its endless focus on visual titillation and suggestion, is just as strange, just as queer.
Now, a critic might push back here. They might say, well, Lewis, that's not a fair comparison. We don't have strip clubs for food because food isn't private or restricted in the same way sex is.
Right. That's the counter-argument, isn't it? That this obsession isn't a sign of brokenness, it's a sign of starvation. Society is depriving us of something natural, so we obsess over it.
And Lewis saw that argument coming. It was very popular in his day, and it still is. He addresses it head on.
He tests the hypothesis. He says, okay, if we found that culture obsessed with watching mutton chops, what's the first thing we'd check?
We'd check to see if there was a famine. And if we found out that actually tons of food was being eaten all the time, we'd have to throw out the famine idea.
So, applying that to sex, he says there's no evidence of sexual starvation in modern culture. In fact, it's the opposite.
Right. Contraceptives had made indulgence much safer and less costly. Public opinion was becoming much less hostile to sex outside of marriage. The cultural barriers were coming down, not going up.
So the idea that we're obsessed because we're being deprived just doesn't hold up to the facts on the ground.
Which leads him to his alternative theory, the glutton's mindset. And this is such a key insight.
Starving men think a lot about food, sure.
But so do gluttons. The person who is already gorged also likes titillations, the appetizers, the suggestive hints of what's to come.
So he's arguing that the non-stop flood of sexualized content we see isn't a symptom of starvation, but a symptom of being overfed and jaded.
Precisely. And it reveals a fundamental law of our sullen appetites. The appetite grows by indulgence. The more you feed it, the more obsessed it becomes.
That completely flips the modern secular narrative on its head.
It does. And then he brings in his final piece of evidence, which is about perversions.
This is where the sexual appetite really shows how uniquely broken it is compared to other drives.
He says, look, perversions of the food appetite are incredibly rare. People don't generally want to eat things that aren't food, like mud or rocks.
And when they do, we treat it as a serious mental illness because it's so abnormal.
It's a statistical anomaly, but perversions of the sex instinct, Lewis notes, are numerous. They're hard to cure, they're frightful, and they are not statistical anomalies. They are a widespread reality.
So the sheer prevalence of that abnormality is the evidence. It points directly to the fact that the instinct is broken in a way that, say, our instinct for food just isn't.
It's the clear, undeniable evidence of the fall's impact on our deepest drives.
Okay, so having made his diagnosis that the instinct is warped, he then moves on to debunk what he calls the good solid lies that modern culture tells us about sex.
The main lie being that the sexual instinct is perfectly fine, just like any other desire, and the only reason it got messed up was because the Victorians were so uptight about it.
This is the ventilation argument, right? Just talk about it more, bring it out into the open, and everything will be healthy.
Yeah, the idea that secrecy creates shame, but transparency creates health. And Lewis says, okay, let's test that. For the last 20 years, he says, we haven't been hushing it up. We've been chattering about it all day long.
And his conclusion? It's still a mess.
It's still a mess. If hushing it up was the cause, then all this talking should have fixed it. But it hasn't. So he suggests the opposite might be true.
That we started hushing it up because it had already become such a mess.
Exactly. The Victorian silence wasn't the cause of the disease. It was a desperate, maybe even clumsy, attempt to contain a fire that was already raging.
He then moves on to clarify what Christianity actually affirms about pleasure, which is so important. He looks at that common phrase, sex is nothing to be ashamed of.
And he says, well, that can mean two very different things. We have to be clear about which one we're talking about.
The first meaning is that the basic fact of human reproduction and the pleasure that comes with it is a good thing.
And Lewis says, if that's what you mean, you're absolutely right. Christianity says the exact same thing. God made it, and it was good.
This is where he brings in that really counterintuitive point from the older Christian teachers.
Yes, that if humanity had never fallen, sexual pleasure would have been greater than it is now, not less.
The fall didn't create pleasure, it just diminished and distorted it.
It's such a vital point. We believe matter is good, the body is good, pleasure is a gift from God. And Lewis even argues that Christianity is almost the only great religion that thoroughly approves of the body
Why does he say that?
because of the incarnation and the resurrection. God himself took on a human body, and we believe we'll be given some kind of glorified body in heaven. We don't believe in escaping the physical, we believe in redeeming it.
So Christianity is all for that first meaning of sex is nothing to be ashamed of. But then there's the second meaning.
Right. The second meaning is that the current state of the sexual instinct, the obsession, the excess, the cultural madness, is nothing to be ashamed of.
And if people mean that, Lewis says they are dead wrong. He says the current state is everything to be ashamed of.
And he brings back the food analogy to show why. He says there's nothing shameful about enjoying a good meal, but we'd all agree it would be shameful if half the world made food the main focus of their lives, spending all their time just looking at pictures of it and drooling.
It's the disproportionate obsession that's the source of the shame.
It's not the desire, it's the disordered and obsessive nature of the fallen desire.
Now, Lewis does offer some comfort here. He acknowledges that we aren't individually to blame for this situation. We're born into it. We inherit warped organisms.
And we grow up surrounded by propaganda that encourages unchastity. And he's sharp enough to see that a lot of this is driven by money.
People want to keep our instincts inflamed to sell us things.
Because a person with an obsession has very little sales resistance. The battle is internal, but it's fueled from the outside.
But that context doesn't become an excuse.
No, he's very clear. God knows our situation. He knows how hard it is. And his judgment takes that into account. What matters, Lewis says, is the sincerity and the perseverance of our will to overcome it.
Which brings us to the practical side of things. How do we actually do this? The practice of chastity.
And the first step, he says, is that you have to actually want to be cured. And for a lot of us, even getting to that point is a huge struggle.
He uses that great anecdote about Augustine praying for chastity as a young man.
Mm-hmm. And years later, Augustine realizes that while his lips were saying, "Oh Lord, make me chaste," his heart was secretly adding, "But please don't do it just yet."
We want freedom from the consequences of sin, but not always from the sin itself.
We want the rule to apply, but with a personal exemption for right now. That's the first big hurdle.
And then he lays out 3 specific obstacles that make it even harder. The first is what I'd call cultural gaslighting.
The lie of normality. That's a good way to put it.
Right.
He says all the propaganda from posters, films, novels, it all works together to make resistance feel perverse or abnormal.
It creates this false link between indulgence and things like health, youth, and good humor.
And Lewis just demolishes that lie. He says, yes, sex itself is healthy and normal, but surrendering to all your desires, that obviously leads to ruin. To disease, jealousy, lies the exact opposite of health and good humor.
So some kind of restraint is necessary for any kind of happy life, even a secular one. The desires themselves can't be trusted.
No. He says every civilized person has to have some principles to control their nature. The real conflict isn't Christianity versus nature. It's Christian principles versus some other set of principles trying to control that same fallen nature.
Which leads to the second obstacle. People just think it's impossible. They give up before they even start.
And his advice here is really sharp, almost military. He says we must never think about possibility or impossibility when a thing must be attempted.
The compulsory exam question analogy.
Exactly. This isn't an optional question we can skip. It's compulsory. God commands it, so we have to do the best we can, even if our answer is imperfect.
He gives examples from real life, like soldiers in a war or someone learning to swim. People do impossible things all the time when duty calls.
But he immediately balances that call to human effort with theological reality. He says you can be sure that perfect chastity, just like perfect charity, won't be achieved by human effort alone.
You have to ask for God's help.
You must. This is where we see the absolute need for grace. Our will is in bondage. Even the desire to be chaste is a gift. But he's also realistic about the struggle. He says even when you ask, it might feel for a long time like no help is coming.
So what do you do then? When you keep failing and it feels like God isn't helping?
This is maybe the most encouraging part of the whole chapter. He says that what God often helps us with first isn't the virtue itself. It's just the power of always trying again.
So after every failure, you just ask forgiveness, get up, and start over.
Immediately. And that process, that cycle of failure, repentance, and trying again, it actually trains us in habits of the soul that are even more important.
What does it teach us?
It cures our illusions about ourselves. We learn we can't trust our own strength. It teaches us to depend completely on God.
Yeah.
And it saves us from despair because we learn our failures are forgiven.
The only fatal thing is to just give up and be content with less than perfection.
Right. The struggle itself, sustained by grace, is what cultivates humility and dependence on Christ.
Okay, and the last obstacle he mentions is this misunderstanding of the word repression.
Yes, people hear that from psychology and get scared that if they fight a desire, they'll damage themselves.
But Lewis says that's not what repression means, technically.
No. A repression is a desire that's been pushed into your subconscious, usually when you're very young, and it pops up later in a disguised form. It's unconscious.
So when an adult is consciously resisting a temptation they're fully aware of.
That's not repression. Not at all. That's just a moral, spiritual act of resistance.
In fact, he says the opposite happens. The people who are seriously trying to be chaste become more conscious of their sexuality, not less.
They get to know their desires like a general knows the enemy or a rat catcher knows rats. They know all the tricks, all the weaknesses, because they're in a daily fight with it.
Which leads to his conclusion. Virtue, even just attempted virtue, brings light. Indulgence brings fog.
A powerful encouragement for anyone in that struggle.
And now we get to the end where he puts this entire difficult subject into perspective. And it's a part that I think is often overlooked, but is maybe the most important.
I agree. He says after all this talk about sex, he has to be clear. This is not the center of Christian morality. If you think Christians believe unchastity is the supreme vice, you're completely wrong.
That's a huge statement. He then says that the sins of the flesh are bad, but they are the least bad of all sins.
The least bad. It's a radical reprioritization. And the reason is that they come from what he calls the animal self. They're tied to our physical appetites, which were originally good, even if they're now disordered.
But all the worst pleasures, he says, are purely spiritual. They come from the diabolical self.
And that's the part of us that's worse. These are the sins of the spirit, the corrupted will.
What are some examples he gives?
It's the pleasure of putting other people in the wrong, of bossing them around, of backbiting, spoiling things for others. It's the pleasure of hatred and power and pride.
And this connects directly to the Reformed understanding of sin, where pride is the root of it all, the desire to be your own God.
Exactly. Lust might be a failure of the flesh, but pride is the fall. It's the core of the rebellion. These diabolical sins are the ones that actively destroy charity and cultivate contempt for others.
So sins of the flesh are sins of weakness, but these spiritual sins are sins of malice and strength.
That's a great way to put it. One often leads to self-destruction, the other to the deliberate destruction of other people. And God finds that cold cruelty of pride far more repulsive.
Which leads to his final shocking comparison. He says a cold, self-righteous prig who goes to church regularly.
Maybe far nearer to hell than a prostitute.
That's designed to just stop us in our tracks. The prig embodies that diabolical self-pride, judgment, self-satisfaction. The prostitute embodies the animal self, a disordered appetite.
And again, he's not excusing the sin of the flesh, but he's correctly identifying that the corruption of the will, which looks down on God and neighbor, is the far greater evil.
And he adds that quick little corrective, of course it is better to be neither.
Right. It's not a choice. It's a recalibration of our moral compass to stop us from thinking that holiness is just about controlling our flesh.
So what does all of this mean for us? Lewis strips away all the cultural noise about propriety to get to the real virtue of chastity in the heart. He sets a very high standard.
He does. But then he puts that whole struggle into his proper perspective. The big takeaway for me is that distinction between the disordered state of the instinct, which is a result of the fall, and the goodness of the thing itself, as God created it.
And it gives us so much guidance on how to handle our failures, not with despair, which is a sin of that diabolical self.
But with renewed action and a total dependence on grace, knowing that the process of repenting and trying again is what's really training our souls in humility and reliance on Christ.
And he forces us to reevaluate what we think of as big sins and little sins.
We spend so much time making sure we don't look like the prostitute, but Lewis forces us to ask if we've ended up looking like the prig.
Which leads to our final thought. If Lewis is right that the worst sins are purely spiritual, rooted in pride and hatred, how often do we, in our fight for a difficult virtue like chastity, secretly cultivate the far deadlier vices of the spirit? Like looking down on others, being satisfied with our own performance, a kind of judgmental coldness. And how often do we mistake that self-satisfaction for true godliness? The real battle for holiness has to start with the humility to see that our greatest danger might not be in our appetites, but in how we see ourselves and how we see others.